To hear this audiobook in full, follow the links in the description below. Thank you for your support. Nonviolence, A History Beyond the Myth by Domenico Losurdo. Translated by Gregory Elliott. Introduction, From the Broken Promises of Perpetual Peace to Nonviolence. In Germany especially, a festive climate accompanied the outbreak of the First World War. Photographs convey images of youth rushing to enlist with the enthusiasm associated with keeping an erotic engagement. Leading intellectuals and great swathes of the population felt the enchantment of what Max Weber called a grand and marvelous war. An exceptional witness described the spiritual climate of Vienna in the days immediately following the declaration of war as follows. Each and every individual was required to cast his little, paltry ego into the ardent great mass to be purified of any egotism. In that majestic moment, all differences of class, language, and religion were submerged in the great current of fraternity. The terrible ordeal facing the country dictated popular unanimity, a fusion of people's lives and consciousness never experienced before. The outbreak of the massive conflict marked an hour of the greatest solemnity, the hour of depersonalization, Entselbstung, of integration into the community, gemeinsame Entrückung in das Ganze. An ardent love of community spread among people, and they felt powerfully united with one another. Having formed a brotherhood, they were ready to destroy their individual identities by serving. The idiom of mystical experience employed by Marianne Weber here was widespread in the culture and journalism of the time. Men certainly hastened to the front in their readiness to die. But in Germany, above all, the dominant culture and philosophy celebrated the test of arms and readiness for sacrifice as a kind of spiritual exercise. The latter had supposedly extracted the individual from calculating rationality and the banality and vulgarity of everyday existence, realizing the communion of spirits hitherto rendered impossible by social conflict and attachment to material goods. Soldiers at the front were indeed forced to face sacrifices and privations, and defy death on a daily basis. But this severe ordeal proved to be a beneficent pedagogy, which transformed callow youth, lacking in firmness, into men with a rich, mature personality and a more virile, more profound sense of existence. Crude, dour natures returned from the front refined, with a more acute sense of the values of community life and solidarity. Benedetto Croce anticipated a regeneration of current social existence from the war that had just erupted and in which Italy had not yet intervened. But this mystificatory communitarianism of war and this passionate quest on the battlefront for authenticity, intensity, and spiritual plenitude could not survive the subsequent painful mass experience. What awaited men in the trenches were mud, total regimentation, and death. It is true that across the Atlantic, immediately following the cessation of hostilities, Herbert Hoover, a prominent member of the American administration and future President of the United States, attributed a function of purification of men to the conflict that had just ended. But this was a belated, largely artificial reprise of a motif that now had little resonance in popular consciousness. 20 years later, not even the initial triumphant victories of Hitler's Blitzkrieg could recreate the enthusiasm of July-August 1914. Pace postmodernists, who miss no opportunity to ridicule the idea of progress, major historical experiences, which are often tragic, do not occur without leaving behind profound traces and more or less diffuse lessons. It is right and fitting to underscore the extremely tortuous character of the historical process, but to speak of progress ultimately means acknowledging the human capacity to learn and the irreversibility of historical time, the impossibility of reverting to a time before the historical experiences that marked entire generations. The magical atmosphere of July and August 1914 will never be recreated. What followed was a disenchantment that has left its mark. War cannot be compared with spiritual exercises and cannot be welcomed as a festivity or a necessary positive moment in the process of the creation and maturation of authentic existence. In Hegel's terms, the experience of the seriousness and suffering of the negative cannot be erased. The same applies to revolution. In its time, the fall of Tsarism and the February days of 1917 were saluted in Russia as an Easter of resurrection. Christian circles and significant sectors of society expected a total regeneration from it, with the emergence of a spiritually renewed and intimately united community. There would no longer be room for the division between rich and poor, not even for theft, lies, swearing, and drunkenness. This prospect was given even more emphatic expression a few months later. What is in the process of being realized is the fourth psalm of the Sunday Vespers in the Magnificat, the powerful overthrown and the poor freed from poverty. Thus a French observer, Pierre Pascal, who was a fervent Christian, greeted the Bolshevik October, while outside Russia the young Ernst Bloch, in the first edition of The Spirit of Utopia, anticipated the disappearance of commercial morality, which consecrates everything that is most contemptible in man, and the transformation of power into love. Such ingenuous enthusiasm, stimulated in February by the fall of an ancien regime that had become universally hated, and in October by the end, or beginning of the end, of a bloodbath now regarded by everyone as intolerable and monstrous, could not survive the emergence of contradictions and bloody conflicts without the new order. Like the mystificatory communitarianism of war and the celebration of the test of arms and life at the front in a spiritualist existential key, exalted revolutionary hopes of a total renewal of society and of human existence as such experienced the terrible impact of actual historical developments. In both cases, people underwent the indelible experience of the seriousness and suffering of the negative. The 20th century was punctuated by wars and revolutions that promised the realization of perpetual peace in different ways, was punctuated, that is, by forms of violence that proclaimed themselves intent on eradicating the scourge of violence forever. In 1900, although peppered with massacres, the joint expedition of the great powers engaged in ruthlessly repressing the Boxer Rebellion in China was celebrated by the French general H.N. Frey as the materialization of the dream of idealist politicians, a United States of the civilized world, as the advent of a world no longer marked by boundaries and conflicts between states. The unity of the civilized countries in the struggle against Asiatic barbarism encouraged such hope. In reality, 14 years later, the horror of the First World War was visible to everyone, and its principal protagonists were the civilized countries previously summoned to guarantee order and peace via their punitive expeditions. But this was insufficient to dispel an ideology that looked to war to promote the cause of civilization and peace. In Italy, Gaetano Salvemini pleaded for Italy's intervention in the bloodbath that had just begun. This war must kill war. It was not legitimate to abstain from war for peace, to quote the phrase that supplied the article quoted here with its title. This was the ideology of the Entente, which with U.S. intervention was to be consecrated by Wilson. The defeat of the Central Powers, branded as synonymous with authoritarianism, and the consequent widespread diffusion of political liberty and democracy had allegedly made the ultimate peace of the world possible at last. Lenin had no difficulty in demonstrating the mystificatory character of this slogan. Germany, which formed the main target of the Entente's crusade on behalf of democracy and peace, itself waved the banner of struggle against warmongering despotism and waved it against a country belonging to the anti-German coalition, namely Tsarist Russia. Far from promoting ultimate peace, appeals to spread political liberty and democracy by any means, did very nicely as an ideology of war on both sides, served, in other words, to fuel an interminable bloodbath. Hence, in Lenin's view, the realization of perpetual peace must be pursued by a different route, starting with the destruction of the politico-social system which, in Germany and the anti-German alliance alike, had fostered expansionist and hegemonic ambitions, the arms race and war. The roots of this scourge would supposedly be removed for good, following the worldwide triumph not of bourgeois democracy, but of socialism. However, historical developments once again turned out very different. Ultimately, the socialist camp broke up as a result of severe tensions, armed conflicts, and wars between countries that had left capitalism behind. Following the tragedies of the 20th century, and the broken promises of wars and revolutions alike, we are led to repeat with Kurt Valentine, comedian and friend of Brecht, "The future was better once." The future no longer appears so radiant as to justify the violence, whether war or revolution, called upon to realize it. Let us be clear, we are not witnessing the disappearance of the amazing ideological constructs or grand narratives of the 19th century referred to by Jean-François Lyotard. Progress contradictorily theorized in this respect by postmodernists, i.e., the great critics of the idea of progress, proves partial and fragile. In our day, the deleterious consequences of the grand narrative, wherein the global spree of democracy, even by force of arms, would tear up the roots of war forever, thus paving the way for perpetual peace, continue to make themselves felt. In the name of this rousing prospect, devastating and sanguinary global policing operations are launched. However, although propagandized for and transfigured by a massive, sophisticated multimedia apparatus, these wars cannot elicit the unanimous enthusiasm and enchantment of yesteryear. The disappointments induced by the actual course of the 20th century prompt a state of mind and attitude that might be summarized thus. Rather than deferring it to a problematic socio-political future, would it not be better to practice nonviolence on an individual basis in the here and now? Why should recourse to arms to bring about change at home and abroad not follow the parabola of other violent practices, witch hunting, slavery, dueling, which flourished in the past but are now difficult to comprehend? Thus in 1896 argued Leo Tolstoy, who, desiring and foreseeing a world without war, added, "The time is near. All that will remain is a vague memory of war and armies in the form in which they exist today." This was a prophecy uttered a few years before the start of the 20th century, which was to see war rage for extended periods in every corner of the globe, in particularly monstrous forms. In 1905, while the revolution that was shaking the Tsarist autocracy in Russia was underway, Tolstoy ventured another prophecy. Violent revolution has outlived itself. One cycle had ended and another had begun, in which the radical transformation of society would occur by peaceful means. It scarcely needs saying that subsequent developments, in Russia and elsewhere, radically falsified that prophecy as well. We are familiar with the blood and tears that have drenched projects to change the world through war or revolution, in very different forms and with very different results. Starting with an essay published in 1921 by Walter Benjamin, 20th century philosophy has engaged in a critique of violence, even when the latter claimed to be a means to just ends. But what do we know of the dilemmas, betrayals, disappointments, and veritable tragedies that have befallen the movement inspired by the ideal of nonviolence? End of introduction. Chapter 1. Christian Abolitionism and Pacifism in the United States. From early Christianity to Christian abolitionist pacifism, the first groups committed to building a socio-political order characterized by nonviolence emerged in the United States. In 1812, when the Napoleonic Wars were raging and the United States was at war with Great Britain, a fervent Christian, David L. Dodge, published what might be regarded as the first manifesto of the nascent nonviolent movement. War Inconsistent with the Religion of Jesus Christ, such was the book's shrill title. Its argument piled it on. It was necessary to abstain from violence, even indirect participation in it, in all circumstances. Governments that did not respect divine law were to be unhesitatingly challenged. Indeed, the spirit of martyrdom is the true spirit of Christianity. And it was criminal to countenance any action that contradicted the Sermon on the Mount, and presumed to legitimize violence. 1828 saw the formation of the American Peace Society, from which 10 years later a more radical organization separated, the New England Non-Resistance Society. Its stated intention was a return to early Christianity. However, what leapt out immediately are two programmatic declarations. First, it was asserted that the gospel message could only be restored in its purity by clearly distancing oneself from the Old Testament and the theme, well attested in it, of holy wars or wars of the Lord. Second, God had not restricted the precepts of the gospel to individuals. They also applied to states. Condemnation of war and violence in any shape or form must be concretely realized at a social level. The innovations compared with early Christianity are clear. It was not wanting in guarantees of continuity with the Old Testament and contained no condemnation of military service in principle. While the early Christians sometimes evaded it, it was so as to avoid taking an oath of obedience to an emperor who, in the state of emergency created by barbarian invasions, tended to have himself adopted as a god. The refusal to take an oath was intended as witness of fidelity to the one true God and authentic religion, rather than the project of constructing a new society. It should be added that in the movement we are examining, the abolition of slavery is involved in the doctrine of non-resistance, as solemnly declared by the Non-Resistance Society. This is a further novel element. We are not led back to early Christianity or even the Quakers, who, notwithstanding their merits, long legitimized slavery. William Penn bought and owned Negro slaves. And in the first decades of the 17th century, a Quaker-dominated government of Pennsylvania enacted a harsh slave code. As regards international politics, violence was rejected by the Quakers with their focus above all on the Christian West, as emerges from an essay of 1693 in which Penn called for the establishment of peace in Europa in order to confront the Turkish threat. No, when we read the American pacifist abolitionists, what we find at work behind them is, in the first instance, the French Revolution, which in the course of its development abolished slavery and witnessed the emergence of hopes that the fall of the Ancien Regime betokened the end not only of dynastic wars, but of war as such. From Paris, Mirabeau had proclaimed that, following the conquest of general liberty, the senseless jealousies that torment nations would disappear and universal fraternity would blossom. Having denounced despotism and the ambition and thirst for power of feudal courts as the cause of the incessant wars that had hitherto racked humanity, numerous other revolutionary actors glimpsed the realization of the philanthropic dream of Abbé Saint-Pierre, namely, perpetual peace. This spiritual climate found its highest expression in the essay published by Kant in 1795. Under a constitution where the subject is not a citizen, and which is therefore not republican, it is the simplest thing in the world to go to war. For the head of state is not a fellow citizen, but the owner of the state, and a war will not force him to make the slightest sacrifice so far as his banquets, hunts, pleasure palaces, and court festivals are concerned. He can thus decide on war without any significant reason, as a kind of amusement. Everything would change with the advent on a European or global scale of a republican or representative constitution. That is, with the introduction of a political system capable of controlling power from below, as had occurred in France. Here we find ourselves in the presence of what, historically, is the first promise of the realization of perpetual peace in the wake of a revolution and radical transformation of political relations. However, prior to the 20th century, the dialectic of the broken promises of perpetual peace manifested itself at the dawn of contemporary history. With Thermidor, the very country that was the protagonist of the revolution exhibited an unstoppable expansionist drive. The problematic character of the discourse of the French Revolution and of Kant himself became especially evident on the American continent. Between 1812 and 1815, a war unfolded there whose protagonists were the two countries, the United States and Britain, that at the time could boast the most advanced representative or republican, in Kant's sense, constitution. This did not prevent the outbreak of hostilities, and in fact the conflict developed with such ideological frenzy as to prompt Thomas Jefferson to declare that it could only end definitively with the extermination of one of the parties to it. The project of transcending the state of violence and realizing perpetual peace, appealing to political change and the community of republican institutions, had turned out to be an illusion. The Christian pacifist and abolitionist movement could not but take cognizance of the fact. Not dissimilar was the acknowledgment expressed later in Friedrich Engels' Anti-Düring. The promised eternal peace was turned into an endless war of conquest. The socialist movement, and Marx and Engels, adhered to the position of the French revolutionaries and Kant. Perpetual peace would be realized by destroying the socio-political system in which the scourge of war was rooted. However, this system was no longer identified as the feudal Ancien Régime and absolutism, but a society based on class oppression, whether feudal or capitalist. By contrast, the American Peace Society and the Non-Resistance Society considered it possible to solve the problem by rediscovering the original Christian message and its progressive penetration of popular consciousness. Nevertheless, the two U.S. movements themselves inherited something from the French Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment that ideologically paved the way for it. We should not underestimate the radical significance of the break with the Old Testament motif of the wars of the Lord, which had repeatedly been mobilized by Protestant pastors in America to cast wars against the Redskins and the French and British alike as holy. Likewise, of great relevance is the project of constructing a political order no longer characterized by violence at home or abroad. What is especially thought-provoking is the juxtaposition of war and slavery. The latter had long been legitimized on the basis of right of war exercised by the victor over the vanquished. One thinks in particular of Grotius. Rousseau, an author especially dear to the Jacobins, had retorted by denouncing slavery precisely as the continuation of the state of war. In Perpetual Peace, Kant paid tribute to the French Revolution both for having abolished slavery in the colonies and for having laid down the premises for the realization of the ideal of peace. And in Christian abolitionist pacifism, active in the United States, the condemnation of war as the consummate expression of violence was intimately bound up with denunciation of the institution of slavery. So unequivocal and intransigent was this denunciation that it seemed fanatical to the ideologists of the slave-holding South, who had no hesitation in comparing American Christian abolitionists with the French Jacobins. The indissoluble link between the two causes is confirmed by the aggression which a few years before the mid-19th century the United States unleashed against Mexico, the victors reintroduced into Texas, wrested and annexed by the North American Republic, the slavery that had been abolished during the War of Independence against Spain. This was the moment of glory of the American pacifist movement, united, despite internal complications and divisions, in its scorn for the war for slavery and unprincipled depravity. Events seemed to fully vindicate the political and moral platform of the pacifist movement as a whole. By contrast, what was evaded in this platform was the issue of the Native Americans. The violence suffered by a pagan people did not seem to arouse the same degree of indignation as that provoked by the imposition of slavery on a largely Christian people. The happy period in the movement against the violence of war and slavery was, however, short-lived. The first signs of crisis soon ensued. What attitude should be taken toward the revolution that invested the whole of Europe in 1848? In the case of France, this was an upheaval that included the definitive abolition of slavery in the colonies, restored in the interim by Napoleon, and the advent in the metropolis of a republic committed to relaunching the hopes and promises of perpetual peace deriving from the Great Revolution of 1789. Unlike on the occasion of the U.S. war against Mexico, pacifist commitment and abolitionist commitment now underwent bifurcation. It was a violent revolution that sealed the abolition of slavery and waved the banner of peace. Put in a difficult position by the new situation, the American Peace Society resorted to a subterfuge. It was cheered by the results, but overlooked the revolution that had yielded them. The repression of the sepoys, war or policing operation. Considered the lesser evil in 1848, the political and moral dilemmas re-emerged in a more acute form 9 years later. In India, the sepoys, Indian soldiers enlisted by the colonial power, unleashed a savage, indiscriminately bloody rebellion, which was followed by a no less ferocious repression marked, in fact, by more systematic cruelty. Giving distinguished expression to one-sided indignation at the horrors of the mutineers was Tocqueville, for whom India's relapse into barbarism would be disastrous for the future of civilization and the progress of humanity. The model country of the West at the time was therefore called upon to act energetically to restore public order in the colony. In our day, virtually nothing is impossible for the British nation, as long as it commits all its resources and all its willpower. The dominant mood in the West also had an influence on the American Peace Society. The majority argued as follows. Even if Britain's rule in India was illegitimate in its origin, the rulers were under an obligation to maintain order and enforce respect for it. In other words, the rebels were wrong to resort to violence, to violate the legal norms in force, and to act as outlaws and criminals in the final analysis. Hence, this was not a war, but a confrontation between common criminality and the forces of order. Support for the latter did not compromise the pacifist cause, which was the cause of a movement that had arisen with the task of fighting against war in the strict sense, i.e., wars between states. This might seem to be a repetition of the attitude adopted in 1848. Indeed, there is an element of continuity. In the first case, civil wars, revolutions are glossed over, while in the second it is wars waged by dominant colonial powers. At the same time, we must not lose sight of the large element of discontinuity. Albeit reticently, 9 years earlier the revolutionary movement had been regarded favorably, whereas there was now open, professed support for the forces of repression. Whereas in 1848 support, albeit hesitant and elliptical, had been extended to the revolution promising perpetual peace, now the general principle of nonviolence concentrated its fire on the violent rebellion of the oppressed, without even criticizing the brutal manner in which order was restored. It was no coincidence if a painful breach occurred. The sister society that had been formed in England, the London Peace Society, did not identify with the attitude of the American Peace Society, and, dissociating itself, did not hesitate to speak of war in connection with the conflict in India, and hence to condemn the British government's violence as well. In fact, the denunciation was now principally focused on the unbounded cupidity and ambition of the colonial power, its shameless aggressions, its attempt to govern India by the sword, and the degradation of 150 millions of people. So while part of the pacifist movement refused to subsume repression of the rebellion under the category of violence, the other part disdained recourse to this subterfuge. Yet while it professed to condemn the various forms of violence practiced by both parties to the conflict, the London Peace Society actually ended up ranking them and pointing the finger primarily at colonialist violence. The attitude toward the catastrophe adopted by Marx was not very different. While recognizing that the insurgents had been responsible for horrific acts, he mocked the one-sided moral indignation indulged in by the bards of colonialism and superior Western civilization. However infamous the conduct of the sepoys, it is only the reflex in a concentrated form of England's own conduct in India. The British continued to ruthlessly wield power of life and death, and in their correspondence frequently boasted of their infamies. Civil war and the split in the pacifist movement. Compounding this initial crisis of the pacifist movement on both sides of the Atlantic was another, which became ever more serious with the gathering of the clouds that presaged the storm of the Civil War in the United States. 1850 saw the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law, which allowed Southern slave owners to recover slaves who had escaped to the North, and also involved the risk for free blacks of being reduced to conditions of slavery once they had been stigmatized as fugitive slaves. This was a new situation, and it created a moral dilemma. The followers of non-resistance had long encouraged slaves in peaceful disobedience of unjust, tyrannical legislation and advised them to escape. What conduct should be suggested to slaves now? With the implementation of the new law, their only hope consisted in escaping as far as Canada. In order to reach the promised land of freedom, however, they had to elude, possibly with the help of white abolitionists, the pursuit of the forces of order determined to apply the law, and hence committed to capturing them. The principle of non-resistance risked falling into crisis here, as was confirmed by the clashes that occurred during the hunts organized to return human livestock to its rightful owners. To avoid the slide into violence, was it necessary to change policy and call on slaves to tamely hand themselves over to the forces of order and hence to the absolute power and possibly also revenge of their masters? In that case, the Christian abolitionists would succeed in preserving their own nonviolent purity and consistency, but by indirectly collaborating with enslavement or re-enslavement and charging the fugitive slaves with a kind of obligation to martyrdom. The divisive character of the debate that ensued is readily comprehensible, and the lacerations grew worse as the Civil War brewing in the United States became obvious. In Kansas, the clash between supporters and opponents of the institution of slavery from 1854 onward led to the formation of two opposed governments and two hostile armed coalitions. Once again, the movement that had developed under the sign of non-violence and non-resistance had to confront a moral dilemma. It had long started out from the presupposition that, restricted as it was to the South, slavery was destined to be extinguished at the end of a process which was to be accelerated to the maximum by incessant but peaceful agitation. How, then, to confront the South's plan, which became ever more clear, of expanding the area in which an institution synonymous with violence was established by force of arms? Committed to countering this were men and women who had often been formed by reading the press of a movement that had been in the van of abolitionist agitation for decades. Were these men and women, who had often been attacked by squattist groups from the South, now to be abandoned? This was the question that disturbed Charles Stearns, one of the strictest figures in the nonviolent and abolitionist movement. In 1840, he had refused to participate in the militia, and in addition to pay the fine imposed on him for avoiding this duty, ending up in prison as a result. Unlike other representatives of the movement, who were more flexible or more pragmatic, Stearns had regarded as unacceptable recourse not only to violence proper, but also to non-injurious physical force used to prevent a criminal. In September 1855, he was still confident. It is always practicable to be a non-resistant and to refuse to obey the devil. But it was not long before an irrevocable crisis supervened. Could the advocates of nonviolence witness the expansion of slavery, as well as the wounding and killing of those who sought to oppose it without reacting? In December of that year, Stearns declared, "I take no part in the warlike preparations, and yet I am fearful that if a fight should occur, I should not be able to stand by and see our men shot without seizing a rifle and pulling its trigger." That is what happened shortly thereafter. At the start of 1856, Stearns crossed the Rubicon, but still audaciously sought to reconcile nonviolent professions of faith with involvement in armed struggle. Having stated that he was no longer capable of being the passive witness of the murder in cold blood of abolitionists in Kansas by slaveholders, he continued as follows. Non-resistance simply forbids the taking of the life of a human being. God never made these fiends. They are devil's spawn and are to be killed as you would shoot lions and tigers. I have always said I would shoot a wild beast. If I shoot these infernal Missourians, it will be on the same principle. If it were an ordinary foe, I should not do it. But these men are not men. They are wild beasts. I love all men as ever, but fools and knaves united, and drunk in the bargain, are not men. Stearns maintained that his decision to fight the slave owners arms in hand was not in contradiction with the principle of the absolute inviolability of human life, because they were not really subsumable under the category of man. Formal consistency was preserved, but violence was quite the reverse of diminished. In proceeding to the dehumanization of the enemy, Stearns seemed oblivious of the fact that watchwords similar to those issued by him were presiding over the genocide of the Redskins. There then intervened the Declaration of Independence by the South and the creation of the slave-holding Confederacy. The terms of the choice that imposed itself were now clear: to pick up the gauntlet thrown down by the slave owners and crush their rebellion by force, or to accept the eternalization of the violence implicit in the institution of slavery. Initially, the American Peace Society seemed inclined to a non-violent separation between the two parts of the Union. In fact, there were those who regarded such a prospect as a turning point in world history, an important step toward the realization of perpetual peace. Yes, wrote George Beckwith in The American Advocate of Peace, this was an opportunity to demonstrate that war could always be avoided. The country, the United States, that had furnished the example of political organization based on self-government and democracy, the fate reserved for Native Americans and blacks was overlooked, was now displaying before the astonished nations another and even sublimer lesson, viz., that a nation may be dismembered, revolutionized, without the shedding of blood. After Fort Sumter, however, in other words, after the Confederacy had ignited the powder by attacking and capturing the Union post located on its territory, the possibility of a peaceful settlement of the conflict was damaged. There were some who, having realized that there was no room for the nonviolent profession of faith in the North or South, fled to London. This was a flight from one's country and responsibilities that was not universalizable. Amid persistent controversy and accusations of betrayal, a large majority of the American Peace Society adopted a pro-Lincoln position. In this case, too, to justify its choice, the movement committed to the cause of nonviolence employed the line of argument that we saw make its appearance on the occasion of the repression of the Sepoys' mutiny. We are faced not with a war, but with a criminal rebellion and legitimate repression of it. Rather than soldiers in the strict sense of the term, the Union's troops are police in the service of public order. This was a formulation that prompted some ironic comments. The police operation was one of unprecedented dimensions, with the participation of hundreds of thousands of men and battles that raged over a vast stretch of territory for years, involving enormous bloodshed. However, if the Union's army was a police corps on an operation to restore order, it followed that the Confederacy's soldiers were to be equated with common criminals, who were to be pursued by justice even after the end of the armed conflict. Thus, the seemingly most consistent pacifists were those most inclined to reject any measure of clemency toward the defeated, and in the first instance toward the President of the Confederacy. In a way, nonviolence turned into its opposite, into exacerbation and continuation of the violence. The agonized development of William L. Garrison. More complex and more agonized was the development of William L. Garrison, the most prestigious leader of the abolitionist and nonviolent movement. At the time of the Kansas crisis, he harshly criticized Stearns and those who declared for armed resistance against the squattist groups from the South. When they justified themselves by claiming that their violence only targeted wild beasts, they argued exactly like the slaveholders who dehumanized blacks so as to be able to deprive them of their liberty. In any event, the betrayal of gospel principles, which enjoined loving and not killing one's enemies, was self-evident. In the immediately succeeding years, Garrison deprecated the fact that the abolitionists were in the process of growing more and more warlike, more and more disposed to repudiate to the principles of peace, and succumb to the spirit of violence, engaging in a bloody work, and thereby compromising their moral power. All this was unacceptable. Much as I detest the oppression exercised by the Southern slaveholder, he is a man, sacred before me, He is a man not to be harmed by my hand nor with my consent. Besides, I do not believe that the weapons of liberty ever have been or ever can be the weapons of despotism. On the night of October 16 through 17, 1859, there occurred the incursion into Virginia of John Brown, a fervent Northern abolitionist who was the author of a desperate, unsuccessful attempt to get the Southern slaves to revolt. This was the turning point in Garrison's development. In the newspaper of the movement led by him, Liberator, October 21, 1859, having defined Brown's endeavor as misguided, wild, and apparently insane, though disinterested and well-intended, Garrison added, "Our views of war and bloodshed, even in the best of causes, are too well known to need repeating here. But let no one who glories in the revolutionary struggle of 1776 deny the right of the slaves to imitate the example of our fathers." In other words, the condemnation of Brown's use of violence stood, but very few were in a position to pronounce it in the United States, where the cult of the Founding Fathers, who were the authors of the bloody revolt begun in 1776, was universal. In other words, if the American Revolution for independence was justified, it was not clear why the anti-slavery revolution should not be. After Brown had been hanged, the South's elation at the restoration of order prompted Garrison to take another step forward. "I am a non-resistant, a believer in the inviolability of human life under all circumstances. I therefore, in the name of God, disarm John Brown and every slave at the South. But I do not stop there. If I did, I should be a monster. I also disarm in the name of God every slaveholder and tyrant in the world. I am a non-resistant, and I not only desire but have labored unremittingly to effect the peaceful abolition of slavery by an appeal to the reason and conscience of the slaveholder. Yet, as a peaceman, an ultra-peaceman, I am prepared to say, success to every slave insurrection at the South and in every slave country." Whenever there is a contest between the oppressed and the oppressor, the weapons being equal between the parties, God knows that my heart must be with the oppressed and always against the oppressor. Therefore, whenever commenced, I cannot but wish success to all slave insurrections. I thank God when men who believe in the right and duty of wielding carnal weapons are so far advanced that they will take those weapons out of the scale of despotism and throw them into the scale of freedom. It is an indication of progress and a positive moral growth. It is one way to get up to the sublime platform of non-resistance, and it is God's method of dealing retribution upon the head of the tyrant. Rather than see men wearing their chains in a cowardly and servile spirit, I would, as an advocate of peace, much rather see them breaking the head of the tyrant with their chains. To the extent that it is possible to get one's bearings in this labyrinth of doubts, oscillations, and splits, we can sum up the position that emerged as follows. Non-resistance continued to be the sublime and, in fact, divinely inspired platform. And in this sense, he notwithstanding his noble intents and heroic conduct, Brown was stained by guilt. But what attitude was to be adopted in the event of a slave rebellion undertaken autonomously? In that case, less than ever did the slaveholders have the right to play the guardians of law and order against the attacks carried out by champions of violence. In reality, the authorities of the South committed to maintaining the status quo were no less violent than the slaves committed to subverting it. And, in the presence of a conflict that saw both contending parties resort to carnal weapons, a choice could be made only by distinguishing between oppressors and oppressed in the hope of victory for the latter. Moreover, in rebelling, albeit in an immature and unsavory way, against an institution that was the most concentrated expression of violence and violation of divine laws, the oppressed exhibited a moral sensibility which was foreign not only to the slave owners, but also to those who bowed their head in the face of injustice. In this sense, despite everything, the rebels' violence represented moral progress, and was perhaps even a divine instrument to punish intolerable iniquity. After Fort Sumter, Garrison was no longer in any doubt. The wave of patriotic indignation and bellicose fury elicited in the North by the Southern troops' attack saw the full participation of the former theorist of non-resistance, who exulted in Such an uprising in every city, town, and hamlet of the North, without distinction of sect or party, as to seem like a general resurrection from the dead. Evangelical language now served not to condemn any form of violence, but to express enthusiasm for the communitarianism of war. The mighty current of popular feeling is now sweeping southward with the strength and impetuosity of 1,000 Niagaras, in direct conflict with that haughty and perfidious slave power which has so long ruled the Republic with a rod of iron for its own base and satanic purposes. Non-resistance had given way to violence, and a violence fueled by theological frenzy. While the secessionists were satanic, Lincoln and the soldiers and people of the North, who are fusing for a death grapple with the Southern slave oligarchy, were cast as instruments in the hands of God. Deprecation of the war was futile and inopportune. Abolitionists had long warned the nation that, if it did not free the slaves, a just God would visit it with tribulation and woe proportional to its great iniquity. From this perspective, even potential violations of jus in bello of the norms dictating respect of prisoners and the civilian population seemed to find a theological justification or consecration. In any event, Garrison came out in favor of exemplary punishment for those guilty of treachery, perjury, treason of the blackest character, for the worst of purposes. The trajectory of the leader of the movement committed to the cause of the abolition of slavery and non-resistance evokes the anguish of a whole generation. Take Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Its hero was a slave, who in gospel fashion confines himself to turning the other cheek to the master who chastises him. Yet the novel concludes by reminding readers that prophecy associates in dread fellowship the day of vengeance with the year of his redeemed, and the stronger law by which injustice and cruelty shall bring on nations the wrath of Almighty God. It is therefore not surprising that, with the outbreak of the Civil War, Beecher Stowe took as a model Nat Turner, 25, the most famous rebel slave in U.S. history. He had rebelled in 1831, convinced that he heard a divine voice summoning him to accomplish the great work of emancipating black slaves, without hesitating to shed the blood of the white oppressors in abundance. Defeated and captured, he had faced death with courage and without displaying any signs of remorse. As in Stearns, in the cases analyzed in this section, at the end of a more or less agonized itinerary, principled rejection of violence turned into a more or less pronounced consecration of violence itself. Armed struggle as lesser evil. More measured, perhaps, was Henry David Thoreau, who, distinguishing himself from the bulk of the pacifist movement, assumed secular accents and was inclined to a pagan cult of nature. At the time of Mexico's invasion by the United States, Thoreau had likewise called for resistance to war and slavery. One could not remain passive. When the sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. The revolution thus invoked was not armed rebellion, but civil disobedience. The new technique of struggle that gave its title to the book, cited here. Nevertheless, Thoreau's tone was radical enough. This people must cease to hold slaves and to make war on Mexico, though it cost them their existence as a people. This involved carrying out a peaceable revolution as and when possible. But what if the bitterness of the struggle led to blood being spilt? Would the remedy not have proven worse than the ill? The answer was not long in coming. It is the fault of the government that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. In short, the most serious violence was that which had already been perpetrated for centuries with the enslavement of the blacks, and which was further exacerbated following the war aimed at wresting territory from Mexico and reintroducing slavery there. Starting from such radical opposition to slave-holding power, Thoreau had no difficulty in making the transition from civil disobedience, construed as peaceable revolution, to resolute moral and political support for Brown, the armed prophet of the desired rebellion by the Southern slaves. In these years, the person who assumed the most lucid and sober attitude was perhaps Angelina Grimke. Taking a stand on the law on fugitive slaves and the acute conflicts provoked by it, this militant with a Quaker tradition behind her frankly and soberly theorized the inevitability in such circumstances of violation of the general principle of nonviolence. As explained in a letter sent to Garrison, a tragic situation had been created with the manifestation of an acute contradiction between two equally absolute and irrevocable values, between which a choice nevertheless had to be made. Although the shedding of human blood is utterly abhorrent to my mind, yet the tame surrender of a helpless victim up to the fate of the slave is far more abhorrent. In this case, it seems as though we are compelled to choose between two evils, and all that we can do is take the least and baptize liberty in blood if it must be so. I now entirely despair of the triumph of justice and humanity without the shedding of blood. A temporary war is an incomparably less evil than permanent slavery. There were still some years to go before the outbreak of the Civil War, but it had in a sense already been evoked. Conscious theorization of the inevitability of resorting to violence allowed Grimke to avoid the criminalization or dehumanization of the enemy. The result arrived at by followers of nonviolence engaged in preserving their formal consistency and impelled by this to assimilate their enemies to common criminals, wild beasts, or instruments of Satan. What jumps out at us, however, is the paradox whereby Grimke regards as incomparably less evil an armed conflict that ended up causing more U.S. casualties than the two world wars put together. To hear this audiobook in full, follow the links in the description below. Thank you for your support.